$283 billion. That's how much one government has spent over the past 2 decades trying to get its own citizens to have more children. Not 283 billion. The largest sustained financial experiment in human reproductive behavior that any government has ever run, anywhere, in recorded history. Here's the number that should stop you cold. During those same 2 decades, while that money was being spent, the birth rate didn't rise. It fell. It fell so far that the country now holds the lowest fertility rate ever measured in a modern society, lower than any country has ever recorded, in war, in famine, in any crisis you could name. Think about what that actually means for a moment. There have been countries that saw their birth rates collapse during active wars, when men were being sent to fight and killed by the hundreds of thousands. There have been countries that saw fertility crater during famines, when families genuinely couldn't feed the children they already had. South Korea, during the exact period this money was being spent, was not at war. It was not experiencing famine. It was, by most economic measures, one of the most prosperous, technologically advanced, safest countries on the planet, a global leader in semiconductors, entertainment, and manufacturing, spending unprecedented sums specifically trying to solve this one problem. And the number still went lower than anything a war or a famine had ever produced anywhere else. That gap between how much effort and money went in and how badly the outcome moved in the opposite direction is what makes this the story worth understanding in full. So how does a government spend nearly $300 billion on a single goal and end up with the exact opposite result? What did they actually spend the money on? Why didn't cash work? And what does the answer tell us about every other country on Earth now quietly considering the same strategy? This is EndGame Analysis. Let's find out why South Korea's massive experiment in paying people to have babies became one of the most expensive policy failures in modern history. To understand how big a failure this actually is, you first have to understand how seriously South Korea's government took the problem and how much money it was willing to commit to solving it. The spending didn't happen all at once. It escalated in structured phases, each one bigger than the last, as the fertility rate kept dropping and each previous round of spending failed to turn it around. The first basic plan for addressing low fertility and aging society ran from 2006 to 2010 and allocated 42.2 trillion won. The second basic plan, covering 2011 to 2015, increased that to 60.5 trillion won. The third basic plan, from 2016 to 2020, nearly doubled it again to 108.4 trillion won. The fourth basic plan, covering 2021 through 2025, committed 196.4 trillion won on its own, more than the first 3 plans combined. By the time you add it all up, cumulative expenditure from 2006 through 2023 exceeded 280 trillion won, roughly 283 billion US dollars, the largest per capita fertility promotion expenditure of any country in the OECD, the group of the world's most developed economies. This wasn't a token gesture or a symbolic policy line item buried in a budget somewhere. By the most recent count, the program's annual budget alone reached the equivalent of nearly $14 billion in a single year, an almost 7-fold increase since 2006. That's not a country dabbling in fertility incentives. That's a country treating this as one of its single highest national priorities, year after year, decade after decade, pouring in more resources every time the last round didn't work rather than questioning the underlying approach. For comparison, $14 billion in a single year is more than the entire annual GDP of several small nations, spent not on infrastructure, not on defense, not on any of the usual categories that dominate a national budget, but specifically and exclusively on trying to convince more Korean citizens to have children. And the spending covered nearly every lever a government could realistically pull. Direct birth bonuses and cash grants to new parents, tax credits for families with children, expanded and subsidized childcare, longer paid parental leave, government funding for fertility treatments like IVF, housing incentives specifically targeted at young families. In some of the more unusual initiatives, local governments even ran government-sponsored dating and matchmaking events, treating the marriage rate itself as a lever worth pulling directly. If you can imagine a financial incentive a government could offer to encourage childbirth, South Korea has almost certainly tried some version of it, at scale, for years. It's worth pausing on the sheer administrative ambition of what South Korea attempted here, because it separates this case from almost every other country's more modest pronatalist efforts. This wasn't one national cash bonus program run out of a single ministry. As of the mid-2010s, roughly 99% of Korea's local governments were independently operating their own version of a baby bonus program on top of the national policies, each municipality competing to offer families the most attractive package, sometimes explicitly to attract young families away from neighboring cities and towns, rather than to grow the national birth rate overall. That detail matters because it means a meaningful share of whatever limited effect these programs did produce may have simply been shuffling the same births between different Korean cities. Rather than creating any births that wouldn't otherwise have happened somewhere in the country at all, here's where the story turns from ambitious to genuinely alarming, because the results didn't just underperform, they moved in the opposite direction from the goal, consistently, for the entire period the money was being spent. When systematic pronatalist spending began under that first basic plan in 2005, South Korea's total fertility rate stood at 1.08 children per woman, already well below the 2.1 needed for a population to replace itself, but not yet in true crisis territory. By 2024, after nearly 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars in cumulative spending, that number had fallen to 0.64, not risen, fallen by more than 40%, while the government was actively spending unprecedented sums specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. In 2023, the rate hit 0.72, and demographers described it without exaggeration as the lowest fertility rate ever measured in a modern society, the lowest number any country has recorded in the entire history of the statistic being tracked globally. Since 2018, South Korea has stood alone as the only wealthy OECD country with a fertility rate below 1.0, an outlier even among the world's other low fertility nations, most of which sit somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6. To put that number in a global context, most viewers of this channel will already have some sense of, from prior coverage on this channel of demographic decline elsewhere. Even countries widely discussed as demographic crisis cases, Japan at roughly 1.15, Italy at around 1.2, China around 1.0, all sit measurably above South Korea's rate. South Korea isn't simply part of the broader story of developed world fertility decline that's affecting dozens of countries simultaneously. It's the extreme outlier within that story, the single data point every other country's demographers point to as the cautionary tale, and it earned that position during the exact stretch of years when its government was spending more money per capita on reversing the trend than any other country on the planet. Even the country's own former president couldn't spin this into a success story. In 2023, then President Yoon Suk-yeol publicly called the pronatalist effort a failure. Think about how unusual that is. Governments rarely, if ever, publicly declare their own flagship, multi-decade, $100 billion policy a failure while it's still ongoing. The fact that South Korea's own head of state said it plainly tells you just how undeniable the result had become by that point. There's a more recent wrinkle worth being honest about, because it's the detail most likely to get thrown back at anyone covering this topic. Births actually rose in 2025 by 6.8%, the largest annual jump since 2007, and continued rising for 18 straight months through early 2026. Marriages jumped 14.9% in 2024, the biggest spike since Korea started keeping records in 1970. On the surface, that sounds like the turnaround the government spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars chasing. Some Korean officials have already begun citing the numbers as evidence the recent, more targeted rounds of spending are finally paying off, and it's worth taking that possibility seriously rather than dismissing it outright, since a genuinely honest analysis has to account for evidence that cuts against its own thesis, not just evidence that supports it. Demographers studying the data are skeptical. It's actually that. The uptick is largely explained by an echo effect, a relatively large cohort of women currently in their early to mid-30s, born during one of the last comparatively large Korean birth cohorts in the mid-1990s, are having children now, later than previous generations, but still within their fertility window. Some of the marriage spike reflects pandemic-delayed weddings finally happening. Critically, the generations directly behind that cohort are dramatically smaller, which puts a hard ceiling on how long this rebound can possibly continue. A Korean studies professor at SUNY Buffalo summarized the skepticism directly. Even with the recent uptick, fertility levels have never recovered to where they stood before COVID, and South Korea still has the lowest fertility rate among all advanced economies on Earth. When asked whether the government's massive spending campaign deserves credit for the recent bump, her answer was blunt. She remains openly doubtful the spending itself made any real difference at all. This is the part of the story that turns a simple, "it failed" narrative into something genuinely useful to understand, because researchers went looking for exactly why all that spending produced so little, and what they found is oddly specific and deeply revealing. A rigorous academic study of Korea's flagship baby bonus program, the direct cash transfer policy that local governments have run since the early 2000s, examined exactly which births the program's payments were actually associated with. The finding: more than 74% of the program's total expenditures went to what economists call inframarginal births, meaning births that would have happened anyway, with or without the cash incentive. The government was, in effect, paying a bonus to the overwhelming majority of parents who were already planning to have that child regardless. Only a small fraction of the total spending was going toward actually changing anyone's decision. And the researchers were careful to note this wasn't some unique Korean failure of program design. It appears to be a structural problem with cash incentive fertility programs generally, in country after country that has tried a similar approach. It's worth explaining exactly why that 74% figure happens, because it's not a mysterious statistical quirk. It's a fairly intuitive problem once you see it laid out. A cash bonus program, by its basic design, pays out to every single family that has a qualifying birth, not just the families whose decision was actually influenced by the existence of the payment. If a family was already planning to have a second child, regardless of any government incentive, and then a bonus program launches, that family still collects the payment. From the government's accounting perspective, that's simply another success story, another birth the program produced. But it wasn't produced by the program at all. It would have happened anyway, and the money spent on that family did nothing to move the actual national birth rate. Multiply that dynamic across hundreds of thousands of births over 2 decades, and you get a policy that looks in its aggregate spending totals like it's supporting an enormous number of families, while the share of spending actually responsible for creating additional births that wouldn't otherwise have happened turns out to be a small fraction of the headline total. A more recent, narrower study out of the Seoul Institute in 2025 found something even more telling at the city level. Using a rigorous difference in differences methodology, researchers found that the Seoul Metropolitan Government's supplementary birth grant produced a temporary 2.3% increase in birth registrations in the month immediately following the announcement. But when they dug into what was actually driving that bump, it turned out to be entirely attributable to parents' timing. The paperwork, delaying the registration of children who had already been born to make sure they qualified for the new payment, not a single additional conception. Just administrative timing, dressed up as a policy win in the headline numbers. And there's a structural allocation problem sitting underneath all of this that the BBC's own reporting flagged directly. According to South Korea's largest daily newspaper, the main reason the government's spending kept underperforming is that most of the money was funneled into childcare subsidies specifically, rather than toward the underlying reasons people were choosing not to have children, or not to have more than one in the first place. The government was solving for the cost of raising a child you already have, while the actual bottleneck was much further upstream in whether people could realistically start a family at all. So what were the actual reasons behind the decline, the ones no amount of childcare subsidy or birth bonus was ever going to fix? Once you look at the structural picture, the failure stops being surprising and starts looking almost inevitable. Start with housing, because in South Korea, housing, marriage, and childbirth are tightly and directly linked in a way that's more extreme than in most developed countries. Out-of-wedlock births account for barely 2% of all births nationally, meaning if young Koreans can't afford to get married and establish an independent household, the birth rate doesn't just decline gradually, it drops off almost entirely for that entire pathway. And affording that household has become close to impossible for a large share of young Koreans. Seoul's price-to-income ratio ranks among the worst in the entire developed world. Buying a home commonly requires 15 to 20 years of median income, saved and accumulated before a purchase is even realistic, even renting. Demands enormous upfront capital under Korea's unusual Jeonse system, in which tenants pay a massive lump sum deposit, sometimes exceeding $400,000 instead of monthly rent. A recent wave of Jeonse fraud, where landlords defaulted and disappeared with tenants' deposits, wiped out the life savings of thousands of young households, with documented cases of victims dying by suicide afterward. When establishing a home costs that much and carries that much risk, no birth bonus measured in thousands of dollars meaningfully changes the underlying math. Set the scale of a typical government birth bonus next to those housing figures, and the mismatch becomes obvious. A one-time cash payment for a new child, even a generous one by international standards, typically amounts to a few $1,000s. A Jeonse deposit alone can run into the hundreds of thousands. A government offering a few $1,000s to a young couple facing a housing system that demands 2 decades of saved income before ownership is even possible isn't addressing the actual barrier standing between that couple and a decision to start a family. It's offering a rounding error against a wall the size of a small mortgage. Then there's the cost of raising a child once you already have one, which in South Korea is dominated by an intensely competitive private education system that government subsidies barely touch. Almost 80% of Korean children attend a Hagwon, a private after-school and weekend cram school, driven by fierce competition for university placement. In 2023 alone, Korean families collectively spent $19 billion on this shadow education system. Families with teenagers in the top fifth of the income distribution spend roughly 18% of their entire monthly income, on average about $869 a month, on private tutoring alone. When the perceived cost of raising each child competitively is that high, a one-time cash bonus at birth addresses almost none of the actual financial pressure parents anticipate facing over the following 18 years. There's also a relational and cultural dimension that no cash transfer was ever designed to touch. Researchers studying the decline point to eroding trust between genders as a contributing factor, tied to broader tensions over gender roles, workplace expectations, and the unequal distribution of domestic and childcare labor within Korean households. When that trust erodes, marriage rates and childbirth follow, and no amount of government money changes how two people feel about starting a family together. Add in South Korea's demanding and flexible corporate work culture, long hours, limited genuine work-life balance, even with expanded parental leave policies on paper, and you have a set of deeply structural barriers to family formation that sit almost entirely outside the reach of a birth bonus or a tax credit. One piece of research does offer a genuinely useful counterpoint here, worth including for balance. Analysis of new town developments around Seoul found that neighborhoods specifically built with affordable, family-sized housing units showed birth rates 15 to 20% above the Seoul average, even after controlling for income, education, and age. That's a meaningful signal. It suggests the problem was never that Korean families are fundamentally uninterested in having children. It's that the specific, narrow financial incentives the government chose to fund almost never touched the actual structural bottleneck, housing, in a way that changed real behavior, while the one intervention that did move the needle, genuinely affordable family housing, received only a small fraction of the overall $283 billion total. It's worth being direct about why South Korea's government kept escalating this spending decade after decade despite the results. Because the stakes underneath this story are genuinely severe, not abstract. South Korea is aging faster than any society in recorded human history. Its population has already declined for 4 consecutive years running, and the country's GDP per capita recently slipped to 5th in Asia, overtaken by Taiwan, a country whose own fertility rate is only marginally higher. Alarmed by the long-term trajectory, the Research Service of South Korea's own National Assembly, the country's parliament, published a warning stating plainly that if the low birth rate trend continues uninterrupted, South Korea's current population of roughly 50 million could shrink to just 10 million by the year 2136. And, in the most extreme extrapolation of the current trend, the country could become completely extinct as a functioning population by the year 2750. Those numbers, especially the more extreme long-range extrapolation, come with all the usual caveats attached to any multi-century projection. They assume no meaningful policy change, no significant rebound in fertility, and no major shift in immigration, none of which is guaranteed to hold true for 700 years running. But the fact that a national parliament's own research arm felt compelled to publish a warning using the word extinct about a 50 million person, economically advanced nation tells you everything about how seriously South Korea's own institutions now regard this problem, even after, or perhaps especially because of, 2 decades of expensive intervention that didn't work. The nearer-term consequences are already visible and considerably more concrete than a 700-year extrapolation. South Korea's working-age population is already shrinking as a share of the total, meaning fewer taxpayers are supporting an increasingly large retired population through the country's pension and healthcare systems. Schools in some rural regions have already closed for lack of enrolled children. Military planners have publicly flagged concerns about the country's ability to maintain current troop levels through conscription in the coming decades, given how much smaller each successive generation of eligible young men is compared to the one before it, a genuinely significant concern for a country that remains technically at war with its northern neighbor. None of these consequences require a 7th century timeline to matter. They're already reshaping budget decisions, school district planning, and defense policy inside South Korea's government right now in real time, which is precisely why the fertility spending kept escalating decade after decade, instead of being scaled back after the early rounds failed to show results. Here's what this entire 2-decade, $283 billion experiment actually teaches, and it's a lesson that extends well beyond South Korea's borders. Because dozens of other countries, from Japan to Italy to Hungary to China, are now running smaller-scale versions of the exact same strategy, watching to see if cash incentives can move a birth rate that's already collapsed below replacement level. The core finding echoed across the inframarginal births research, the Seoul Institute study, and the broader academic literature on pronatalist policy is this. Money spent on the wrong lever doesn't just underperform, it can fail almost completely while looking on paper like serious action is being taken, most of South Korea's spending went toward reducing the marginal cost of a child parents. We're already planning to have, rather than toward removing the structural barriers, unaffordable housing, brutal educational competition, inflexible work culture, eroding trust between genders, that were actually preventing people from choosing to start families in the first place. The one piece of evidence that did show a real effect, affordable family housing in Newtown developments, points directly at the kind of expensive, slow, politically difficult structural reform that a cash bonus is specifically designed to avoid having to undertake. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. It's far easier, politically and administratively, for a government to write a check than to fundamentally restructure a housing market, an education system, or a workplace culture. Cash bonuses can be announced in a single press conference, distributed through existing administrative systems, and shown as a concrete budget line item in the next election cycle. Rebuilding a housing market, retooling a school admission system that drives an entire private tutoring economy, or renegotiating decades of entrenched corporate work culture requires years of sustained political will across multiple governments, resistance from powerful existing interests, and results that may not show up in the data until long after the officials who pushed the reform have left office. Faced with that choice, it's not hard to understand why successive Korean governments kept reaching for the faster, more visible option, even as the underlying number kept getting worse. South Korea spent nearly $300 billion finding out, the hard way, and in the most rigorously documented fashion of any country on Earth, that the easier option doesn't actually work. Whether other countries currently running their own smaller pronatalist experiments, Japan, Hungary, Singapore, and increasingly China among them, learn that lesson before spending their own hundreds of billions, or have to discover it themselves the same expensive way, is very much still an open question. Some early signs suggest at least a few governments are paying attention. Hungary's more recent policy shifts have leaned harder into housing-linked incentives, specifically because of cases like Korea's, rather than pure cash payments alone. Whether that adjustment produces meaningfully different results or simply repeats the same underlying mistake in a different form is a question only more years of data will answer. If this breakdown showed you why the world's most expensive fertility policy experiment failed, subscribe to EndGame analysis, because we're going to keep tracking which countries actually manage to bend this curve, and which ones just keep writing bigger checks. Tell me in the comments, do you think any country eventually cracks this problem? Or is declining fertility simply the price of modern developed life that no policy can reverse? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. One final number worth leaving you with, because it frames everything else in this video better than any single statistic already. Covered, $283 billion is roughly what South Korea has spent trying to move a single demographic number by a fraction of a percentage point, and it still went the wrong direction for most of that period. Whatever comes next, in Korea or in any of the dozen other countries now watching this experiment closely, we'll have to reckon with that number and with exactly what it did and didn't buy. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.